On behalf of the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies International Forum Series, we welcome you to the Harold B. Lee Library for today's lecture by Professor Peter J. Katzenstein of Cornell University on American Primacy and Anti-Americanism in World Politics. We apologize for the cramped quarters. Would like to make you aware of the fact that a video archive of this lecture will be available this afternoon on the Kennedy Center's website at kennedy.byu.edu. For those of you who are here with personal interest, that will be available for you to watch a rebroadcast of the lecture. As is our custom, we'd like to begin with an invocation. We've asked Julie Fry to offer that. Julie is a political science major coming from Seattle, Washington. After the opening prayer, we'll turn the time over to Professor Wade Jacoby, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Europe, who will introduce our speaker today.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this opportunity that we have to be gathered in this university, and we're grateful for the efforts of many who have worked to bring Dr. Katzenstein here, and please bless him in his presentation, that he will be able to speak to us and that our hearts will be open and ready to receive his message. And this we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you for coming and showing such interest in an important topic. Our speaker today is Professor Peter Katzenstein. Peter is the Walter S. Carpenter Jr. Professor of International Studies in the Government Department at Cornell University in New York. Professor Katzenstein received his PhD from Harvard, his master's degree from the London School of Economics, and did an undergraduate at Swarthmore College, but he is originally from Hamburg, Germany. He has been at Cornell for, it must be 30 years now, 31 years at Cornell. He's the author of a staggering number of books on European and international politics. Some of them will give you, the titles of some of them will give you a flavor of the wide range of areas that he's worked on. Network Power, Japan and Asia, and Tamed Power, Germany and Europe. Those two books together in the late 90s. Cultural Norms and National Security, Industry and Politics in West Germany, Small States and World Markets, and a classic of international relations in the late 70s called Between Power and Plenty. Professor Katzenstein's current project is called Open Regionalism in the American Imperium, Japan and Asia. The subtitle is Japan and Asia, Germany and Europe. The title of his lecture today is American Primacy and Anti-Americanism in World Politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Katzenstein.
Thank you very much. I know there's 60 of you here who might want to play outside right now. So the hall is full in part because you're taking a course on American foreign policy. I came too late. I arrived Monday at 11 o'clock. I meant to come earlier in order to celebrate the licking of Utah in basketball. So the definition of a professor is a person who talks while other people sleep. It will be a sleep of no more than 30 minutes. I will make a very ungraceful exit from this talk, okay? Because I rather enjoy talking with you rather than talking at you. The topic itself is part of, professors get free time. So my free time is next year. I have a sabbatical. I'll be out at Stanford. And I'm doing a project on the subject of this talk, Anti-Americanism. And this is a preliminary way of thinking about it based on some research I've done and some workshops I'm running this spring. Let me start. For those of you who take that American Foreign Policy course, there are 4 articles in the Wall Street Journal, late January, early February. Don't miss them. Okay? Here's an excerpt from an article from February 3rd by Peter Waldman. It's a series of articles on the American Empire. I'll read just a few excerpts to set the tone. Call it the Lewis Doctrine. Though never debated in Congress or sanctified by presidential decree, Mr. Lewis's diagnosis of the Muslim world malaise and his call for a U.S. military invasion to seek democracy in the Mideast have helped define the boldest shift in U.S. foreign policy in 50 years. The occupation of Iraq is putting the doctrine to a test. Lewis's, who is a retired professor at Princeton, a very prolific scholar of the Mideast. I think Bernie Lewis is now 87. His exposition and the policies it helped set in motion heralded a decisive break with the doctrine that prevailed during the Cold War. Containment, Mr. Kennan said. Mr. Kennan is a guy who wrote an article by Mr. X in a journal called Foreign Affairs in 1947, which articulated the view, the containment doctrine. Okay? Containment, Mr. Kennan said, had nothing to do with outward histrionics, with threats or blustering or superfluous gestures of outward toughness. It rested on the sober calculation that even the most aggressive enemy wouldn't risk its own demise by provoking war with a powerful United States. The Lewis doctrine posits no such rational foe. It envisions not a clash of interest or even ideology, but of cultures. In the Mideast, the font of terrorism threat, America has but two choices, both disagreeable, says Mr. Lewis. Get tough or get out. His celebration rather than shunning of toughness is shared by several other influential U.S. Mideast specialists. The question people are asking is why they hate us. That's the wrong question, said Mr. Lewis on C-SPAN shortly after the September 11th attack. In a sense, they've been hating us for centuries, and it's very natural that they should. You have this millennial rivalry between two world religions, and now, from their point of view, the wrong one seems to be winning. He continued, more generally, you can't be rich, strong, successful, and loved, particularly by those who are not rich, not strong, and not successful. So the hatred is something almost axiomatic. The question which we should be asking is, why do they neither fear nor respect us? For Mr. Lewis and officials influenced by his thinking, primarily, by the way, Vice President Cheney, instilling respect or at least fear through force is essential for America's security. This is a very concise and, I believe, accurate summary of the thinking behind the President's foreign policy since 9/11. So I want to organize my talk around two big clusters. One is the concept of American primacy, and the other one about anti-Americanism. American primacy has, in my way of thinking, three dimensions. One is economic, the second is military, and the third is expressed in our policies. What about the economic dimension? In the 1990s, the American economy could do no wrong, and in the last 3 or 4 years, we have noticed that indeed not everything is well. We've experienced the sharpest increase in unemployment since 1973-75, the most sustained loss of jobs since Herbert Hoover. We are facing now what Japan and Europe have faced in the last 10 years, the prospects of a jobless recovery. The number of long-term unemployed has increased to 2 million. The budget deficit is considerably larger than the 3% budget deficit mandated in Europe, which France and Germany have surpassed. That is, they are not coming to the 3%, they are at 4%. The turnaround in the fiscal future of this country is truly astounding. From a $2.6 trillion surplus at the beginning of the Bush administration's turn to a $5.5 trillion deficit projected by the Bipartisan Congressional Budget Office now. That's a $7 trillion turnaround. I'm not going to pay for it. Neither is Wade. Okay? You are going to pay for it. Cornell students seem utterly, blissfully, that's no problem. I say good luck, okay? $7 trillion, okay? And by the way, the tax cuts, in my mind, were utterly right. It would be idiotic not to cut taxes during a recession. That's the only way of starting up an economy. So what the Democrats are saying, in part, is histrionics. On the other hand, who do you cut the taxes for? And are they permanent or not? Those are the two big issues on the table. And then our trade deficit helped along, certainly by Cornell students, maybe by BYU students. I looked through their bookshop. It's a nice shop, not just books, is now $500 billion a year. For total foreign exchange reserves in the world, here are some figures to make you think, oh, who is supporting us? China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, about $750 billion reserves together. Okay? 450 for China, 200 billion for Taiwan, and the rest for Hong Kong. Japan, $620 billion. Europe, $320 billion. The United States, foreign exchange reserves, $72 billion. 1/20th of what China, Taiwan, Hong Kong control. Foreign holding of U.S. stocks, bonds, and other assets exceed American holdings of foreign assets by $2.3 trillion, about 20% of our GDP. Britain, at the height of its empire, had foreign assets valued at 150% of its GDP. This is not a great change. These ownership figures haven't changed much over the last 30 years. But our degree of indebtedness has increased greatly, so much so that publications like The Economist, who like the United States, they are not critical, in 1999, at the height of our economic success, were concluding that GDP growth per capita, quote unquote, the single best measure of economic performance, in the 1990s was running at 2% for Germany, 1.6% for Japan and the United States. It paid to be sclerotic Europe at that time. Since then, of course, the government has reduced its official statistics about gains in industrial productivity, profitability, and employment. That is, the figures for 1999-1990 were not as good as we thought they were in 1999. And we had the corporate scandals on top of it. The economic foundation of American primacy, to me, look shaky. And I think the people who are going to determine this are the voters. Because you would have to invest a lot of money in an empire, and we don't have it. What about military primacy? In the early 1990s, I went around college campuses and gave lectures about the collapse of the Soviet Union and what it meant for the United States. And I used comparative defense spending figures. And it was quite clear then, looking at the figures, that Soviet and Russian defense spending were, depending on which conversion you use, between $5 to $25 billion, while the American defense budget was around $300 billion, 280. Okay. And so that we were no longer in a bipolar world. There was a problem with that lecture. People looked at this and didn't think it was right. As Russia was still in the Soviet Union, was a superpower. It no longer is in our heads. We've changed our minds. And by now, it's clear for everybody that we are living militarily in a unipolar world. There's only one superpower. That's us. There's our defense budget. It's a hard way of counting. I say $500 billion, but it's not quite. It's more than that, because the allocations for the war are not part of the regular defense budget, are more than the defense budgets of the next 15 countries combined. And all of the next 15 countries want to be on our side. So you can ask yourself, what's the use of spending so much on the military defense? And some people in this country are asking that. Many people outside this country are asking that. The military victories in Afghanistan and Iraq confirmed what both proponents and opponents of both wars predicted. The U.S. would win. We won in Iraq with half the troops in half the time compared to 1990, not because we had new high-tech weapons, but because the Iraqi army was at half its fighting strength compared to 1999, because of the sanctions. The low casualty figures during the war surprised and invalidated the arguments of the opponents of the war who said there would be widespread urban warfare. And that was wrong. The Republican Guard had no fight in it. It melted away. But the urban warfare came after the cessation of the war. And it's going on now. So, looking at it, a great military victory can still end up as a political defeat. War, after all, is the continuation of politics with other means. And it pains me to say that a Cornell graduate, Paul Wolfowitz, has a lot to do with the defeat which we have suffered since the war ended. Who is fighting us? It is a heterogeneous coalition of remnants of the old regime, of criminals who Saddam Hussein released from prisons, thousands of them, in December, of Sunni nationalists, of some Shiites, and of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda clearly is gathering in Iraq as a consequence of the war, not as a cause of the war. So, and we are now here in Iraq stuck without an exit strategy. The rationale for the war, regime change, is now advertised as the only reason. But it wasn't the only reason. The reason given by the Bush administration was an immediate security threat to the United States. Weaponized weapons of mass destruction. Not weapons of mass destruction, weaponized weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed in battle and on the short term. We now know that those weaponized weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. There may be weapons of mass destructions, but they were not weaponized. And so in the run-up to the war, it is quite clear, I think, that the administration was stretching the intelligence. There is something crazy going on in our politics. Liberals have turned conservative, and conservatives have turned extremist. How did this happen? And this is the third point about American primacy, after the economic and military. And that is the effect of 9/11 on U.S. policy. I had a fellowship in 2001 and was in Manhattan on 9/11, on East 64th Street. And being in Manhattan, I can tell you, it left a deep imprint on me. My students in Ithaca, it left an imprint on them, but not as deep. 9/11 had a deep imprint on New York City and on Washington. And it will be very important not to underestimate that the president reacts to an experience, as does the cabinet, which they lived through. Our dramatic change in policy is due to a dramatic event in our history. The election of 2000, we elected a president who preached humility and caution, a realist pragmatist who would hire realist pragmatists, experienced ones, who would run his foreign policy. It was one of the strengths of the president to realize that he was unprepared to run foreign policy. He had the strength of character to hire people who were much smarter about it than he was, an important trait of leadership. So he appoints a seasoned team. But after 9/11, the administration argues that a revolution in world politics has occurred, and global terrorism is being interpreted from then on in the frame of an international state system conflict. The terrorists are not states, and we have a hard time catching or fighting them, as do any other states. But we have an easy time, the way we are organized with a superb military, to fight wars. And so within a very few weeks after 9/11, the war on terrorism gets redefined as a war on evil states. The disagreement, which is going to be very central in this election campaign, is between being soft or not soft on military defense. I think this is a red herring. Kerry says, you've got to catch the criminals, the terrorists. Bush says, you've got to fight the states with weapons of mass destruction. And it's quite clear that you have to do both. So don't be taken in by the rhetoric. Both things are going on now. There's a lot of sharing of police intelligence because all states have an interest in catching the terrorists. Okay, I got, according to my reckoning, 10 more minutes. I think we rushed into the war for reasons which were not only related to the events of 9/11 directly. They were related to broader geostrategic interests, and in particular, to say it in 3 letters, OIL. This is an administration which is staffed by people who know the energy industry extremely well. And what happened on 9/11 was, after all, that 15 of the 19 people in these airplanes were Saudi citizens. And we had made a pact with Saudi Arabia in 1976. And it was a very straightforward deal. We will protect you, the House of Saud, okay, roughly 6,000 princes, and you will run a reliable and responsible energy policy. And both sides heeded this pact. But the House of Saud had at the same time make peace inside Saudi Arabia. And that meant it had to make peace with the clerics, a particular radical version of Islam, Wahhabism. And since 1979, Saudi Arabia has exported, not just oil, but 20,000 freedom fighters. Okay. They are fighting in Chechnya, they've fought in Bosnia, some of them are now in Iraq. If you click on, as Kiran Chaudhry, a colleague of mine at Berkeley with whom I just talked 2 days ago, if you click on the Saudi web pages, you will find people who look like Rambo with the heads of Che Guevara, and people writing poetry for a whole new class of manly warriors who cannot do wrong, who will always win, even when they die. There are about 100 of these, and it's a full new form of Saudi nationalism, made possible by the Internet. Okay. The Saudi government is in a very difficult position, and it was. And it would have been foolhardy for any president to count on continued Saudi support. The CIA in the year 2002 estimated the chances of another catastrophic attack on the United States to be 1 in 3 in the coming decade. By catastrophic attack, they meant an attack with 20,000 to 200,000 casualties. It would have been foolish for any president, Democrat or Republican, not to think about the possibility of another attack, disastrous attack, coming from Saudi Arabia. And the second time around, Congress would not have sat still. So thinking about an alternative source of energy for us was geostrategically important, and I'm sure it figured prominently in the deliberations. I hope it did. Okay? I'm pretty sure it did. By moving as we did, unilaterally and without the support of the United Nations, we increased the security risk of other countries with large Muslim populations, particularly in Europe. So the opposition of other countries to this is no surprise. Other countries have lived with terrorism for much longer. Shoko Asahara, last week, got the death sentence in a trial which lasted for 8 years in Tokyo. He was the guru, the head of Aum Shinrikyo, which staged the first attack on civilians with weapons of mass destruction. That was in 1995, the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway. Aum Shinrikyo was a transnational terrorist organization. It had more members in Russia than in any other country. It had assembled the technology for attacking Tokyo with helicopters, aerial spraying, which would have caused tens of thousands of fatalities. And the pilots for those helicopters were trained in Florida. Okay? So what happened in 9/11 was rehearsed before. The Japanese didn't react the way we did to terrorism. Terrorism has been a staple of Japanese history for 100 years. We reacted differently because it evoked in us a response. I was there on 9/11, which was Pearl Harbor. Blue sky, surprise attack. And so we changed much more in response to 9/11 than any other major state in the world. So the policies which we have followed, apart from the economic foundations and the military supremacy, are extremely important what's happening to American primacy in world politics. Let me turn to the second part, the anti-Americanism. Why do they not like us, or why do they hate us? Anti-Americanism, if you look at survey results, basically is measured in 2 ways. You ask questions about, do you like the United States and its policies? And most people say in the world, no, we don't. You ask questions about, do you like America, the American people, American society? And most people in the world will say, yes. It is a striking gap, and the gap has grown enormously since 9/11, and in particular since the run-up to the war in Iraq. So anti-Americanism is anti-the United States government policy. There's something also maybe about the president, who turns out to be a deeply polarizing personality, just like Bill Clinton was, okay, or Hillary Clinton. That is, well, we saw it in domestic politics. You want to galvanize the Republican base, all you have to say is Hillary Clinton. Okay? And the same happens with Bush, domestically, but also internationally. He is not the great uniter. He is a great divider for reasons which I find really hard to grasp. Because I think it looks to me like a pretty average, not very curious, likable American guy, right? But he really pushes people's wrong buttons, abroad more than at home. So there is this personality dimension, but I don't think this is what's driving the anti-Americanism. The anti-Americanism is driven by U.S. thinking about the U.S. as a state with its distinct policies. So if you think back, after 9/11, there were mass demonstrations all over the world, especially in Europe, expressing sympathy for the United States. And then in February 2002, we had the largest coordinated set of demonstrations worldwide which have ever happened on a particular issue. I think it was February 13th or 15th, 15 million people marching. Europe has never seen anything like it. Demonstrations in Italy, 2 million people. In London, our trusted ally, 1.5 million. These were the largest demonstrations since 1945. So this anti-Americanism, and it takes lurid forms. You go to European bookshops in France or in Germany and England, you pick up bestsellers, which we would call crackpot theories. I mean, conspiracy theories about that the Americans were flying the planes and all of this. Seems crazy, but it's part of this anti-Americanism. Shift from Europe to Korea, close ally of the United States, a remarkable story of democracy. Anti-Americanism in Korea is running rampant in a most civilized and dignified way. I was there 3 weeks after the candle vigils which the Koreans had, and talked to people, and everybody was deeply moved. This was not the Korean left shouting slogans. This was the Korean society marching, intergenerational, with babies, with grandparents. The support of the United States dropped by more than half within 5 years in Korea. Think of Turkey. Turkey is our vision of the Middle East, a democratic, modernizing or democratizing modern Muslim state. We offered the Turks over $20 billion before the Iraq war, so that we could use Turkish space to attack Iraq from the north. Turkish parliament didn't go for it for the obvious reason that 90% or more of the Turkish population was opposed to the war and to the United States. This is the most favorable outcome for Iraq. A modern, democratic, secular Iraq will be overwhelmingly anti-American. But since the world isn't going to produce the nicest outcome for us, think about what people call the Arab street. Okay? Masses of people, and I'm not talking about Iran, in the Middle East, Jordan, fairly friendly. A student of mine wrote a book on Jordan. Okay? 66%, when asked, admire U.S. science, admire U.S. education, admire U.S. popular culture. But 20% admire the United States government or its policies. Huge gap. American power is great, and if you talk to people, the term which always comes up is betrayal and hypocrisy. American policy is hypocritical, and it betrays. What does it betray? It betrays the ideals which we articulate as a society, and particularly our government. We are incredibly moralistic in how we cast our political objectives, always. So there is inevitably a shortfall. You raise the expectations, and then you can't deliver. This happened throughout the Cold War, because we were, in fact, building an anti-communist coalition. It's happening now in the war on terrorism, because you have to make deals with very shady characters, like the general who's running Pakistan, right? Who's exporting weapons of mass destruction. But it's not so bad. He's on our side right now. Right? But people point to this, and it adds this psychological edge. You've done us in because we like the Wilsonian message. And you have the power to deliver on it, but you don't do it. So there's a deep source of ambivalence about this anti-Americanism, because there is a liking of America, and many of the values America stands for. And there is a deep sense of betrayal and disappointment about how we conduct our foreign policy. Now, here are very briefly, 3 general sources and 3 specific sources of anti-Americanism. And I promise you I will do this in 5 minutes. Factor number 1, power imbalances and threats. This is what Lewis is talking about. There is a way of thinking, saying if there's one big power, you've got to create a balance of power against it. This was how China was thinking and conducting its foreign policy in the mid-1990s. This is certainly how France was conducting its foreign policy in the run-up to the war. This was certainly how Saddam Hussein was fighting the first Gulf War. It was a balance of power thing. And this is how Bernard Lewis is thinking about the world. There's a second general force for anti-Americanism, and I call it globalization backlash. And it might take various forms. It might be economic disappointment. It might be cultural revulsion. Globalization comes in many different ways. And the demonstration in Seattle from 1999 show you it's a very incoherent, broad coalition with everybody sort of having their own political agenda. This is happening in Latin America to some extent, but it isn't happening in East Asia. It's happening to some extent in the Middle East, but it isn't happening that much in Africa. But it is a second force, and the Lewis doctrine doesn't really talk about it. It makes the situation more complicated. Thirdly, conflicting identities. Our national interests are to some extent defined by who we are. It's not only true of America, it's true of all societies. So we are exporting. You know, we are exporting to some extent religion, because many of you have gone abroad. We are also exporting the commercialization of sexuality, or women's rights, and popular culture. And those exports, you know, in some parts of the world, they're experienced as deeply threatening or distasteful. In some other parts of the world, they're experienced as indifference. And in some parts of the world, much of our youth culture is embraced. The role of the media is particularly important. It paints, if you look at American TV, it paints an utterly unrepresentative picture of America. But this is the access which the world has to America. So whether you are running a Leninist capitalist system in China, or whether you belong to a fundamentalist Hindu party in India, or whether you are an atheist in Europe, the exports of America, both religious and secular, will feed into this sense of they are different from us, and they will become a source of anti-Americanism. That third factor, besides the balance of power and anti-globalization, is something which the Lewis doctrine doesn't catch. I think it's of great importance. Here are 3 specific factors, equally important, I believe, to the 3 general ones. History and memory of grievances. We are a great power. We've done a great deal of good in the world. I wouldn't be standing here if the U.S. hadn't fought Nazi Germany. I was born in 1945. I'm a great admirer of U.S. military might. Because without it, maybe Adolf Hitler would be running Europe. But we also have done great harm in the world, either by just being big and stupid, or actually willfully. Big powers are big, you know, there's a saying. When the elephants make love, the grass suffers, right? So, and of course, most countries, we have 192 states, most of them are small. We throw our weight around, we don't even notice it. But they experience it. But sometimes we actually do things willfully well. So think about if you were in China, or in South Korea, or in Indonesia, where we contributed to or Vietnam, to the death of millions through our foreign policy. Or in Europe, if you were in Greece, where we intervened in the Civil War, and the Greeks have hated us ever since. Or in Spain, where we supported a fascist regime for reasons of anti-communism, the Franco regime in the 1950s and 1960s. Anti-Americanism has always been very high in Spain and Greece. Or in Central America, where if you just look at what's happening now, that's what's happened for 100 years. Or Latin America, where we supported many military dictatorships for decades and decades and decades. We have, through our actions, created a history and a memory of grievances, which is easily turned to anti-Americanism. The second specific factor, anti-Americanism is part of the politics of democracy and democratization. This is the era of democracy. Democracy is spreading. The fact that anti-Americanism becomes a message which is useful for contesting political office in these new democracies should not surprise us. It, in fact, is an ideology around which you can collect a large coalition to support you getting to office. And if you live in an autocratic government which is trembling because it is nervous about the process of democratization, you will be anti-American too, because you're extremely nervous about students or anybody else marching in the streets, shouting, "Down with Bush," because that crowd might just turn on you. So you're actually much more attuned to the radical fringes because you don't like the dissent against anybody, because that dissent might be refocused on those who hold power illegitimately. So in an era of democracy and democratization, anti-Americanism is bound to be a powerful symbol and a powerful political tool used for instrumental, narrow purposes by self-interested political elites. It isn't just us who has self-interested political elites. Every democracy has them. And finally, the third specific factor, besides the history and memory of grievances, and besides the force of democracy and democratization, is the regional context and the transnational connections between countries. It would be wrong to think about anti-Americanism just as a relationship between that country and the United States. That country normally has neighbors, and very often those neighbors are deeply detested, more so than the United States. China, for example, and Japan don't like each other. They may not like the Americans, but they hate each other more. The quality of anti-Americanism is very much influenced by this hatred between China and Japan. This also explains India and Pakistan, Japan and South Korea, and many other conflictual special relationships. But it isn't just the regional context, it's also the transnational contexts. Migration between South Asia and the Middle East. Many Indians from Kerala, let's say, work in the Middle East or from the Philippines. Bring back not only cash, also messages. It's a way of spreading anti-Americanism. Many people, Muslims from the Middle East, end up in Europe. Europe had 700,000 Muslims 30 years ago. It now has 17 million. It's the fastest growing population. The Muslim bomb, it's called, by the European neo-fascists. Okay. Well, the contacts between the Middle East and Europe are intense, particularly in the religious schools. And the police is keeping good track after 9/11 of religious schools, which have become breeding grounds for training people ideologically to fight the good fight, jihad. So let me conclude. Anti-Americanism is a prejudice, like many others. Unlike others, it's becoming fashionable and politically acceptable. It is a universal language by which to do politics. If it's universal, it is also American. We have a lot of anti-Americanism in the United States. We've had it for 150 years. Mark Twain is a superb example of an anti-Americanist. We were imperialist. He didn't like it. He demonstrated and wrote against America. So what does it mean to be anti-American? This president was elected by a vote of 5-4 and lost the popular vote by 500,000 votes. Americans are pro and anti-American. And the electoral season which we're entering will be the most divisive which I've experienced in my lifetime here. I came in 1964. The same is happening in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe. Us versus them becomes a way of organizing politics. So the US war on terrorism has moved us into uncharted territory. And all governments in the world, not just in Washington, are rethinking basic assumptions of world politics that have been unquestioned for half a century. The possibility of trading in consent for coercion, which is what we are trying to do now, may well create a world disordered, even though after September 11th, what we wanted most of all was to achieve a more secure and orderly world. But what is possible is not preordained. Political choice will be enormously consequential in how this game is going to be played. But the central point of this lecture is that America's primacy and anti-Americanism are closely related. And the relationship is a whole lot more complex than the Lewis doctrine, which talks only about instilling fear and respect, anticipates. So unless we become more sophisticated in our foreign policy, the choices which we're going to make are unlikely to be the best ones. Thank you. All right, I know that some of you have to go to class in about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. Let's start, and then when the mass exodus starts, we'll just stop for a little while, and then go on until about 10 past 1, 5 past 1. Yes. There are two here, one in front and then there.
You mentioned some conflicts we have in our relationship with Saudi Arabia. What kind of action do you think we should take policy-wise against Saudi Arabia?
I think what we can do in this situation, which is when the basic legitimacy of the government is at stake, is limited. But you certainly have to lean on them. And I think we are leaning on them. And after the conclusion of the war, we were going to get out right away, out of Saudi Arabia. We didn't. We waited because there was a big bombing attack. But we have basically withdrawn from Saudi Arabia. That is, we have a strategic base there with pre-positioned war material. The Saudis were very leery about giving permission for us to use that base. We knew this, so we had built up another base in Qatar. Right? So the war was mostly fought from that base. So what you're seeing between these two states is a process of selective disengagement. The Saudis think that they are being destabilized since the United States in 9/11 is incidental. We were picked as a target not because we matter, but because Osama bin Laden wants to overthrow the House of Saud. It is a conflict within Saudi politics. And we become the symbol because we are the evil Satan. And the House of Saud needs to be overthrown because it's done wrong, fundamentally wrong. So from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, as they say, distance yourself. And the United States, I think, is doing the same thing in the military strategic sphere, but it cannot do it in the energy sphere. We don't have an energy policy. We've never had one. We don't want to have one. We're not politically organized to have one. And even if we had one, like Japan, we would still need Saudi oil. So it won't be a total rupture. That would be too costly for both sides, but it will be selective disengagement, which means, and this is the depressing part, we will not and cannot get out of Iraq. We can get the soldiers off the streets in Iraq. But for geostrategic reasons, we will be in Iraq because we need to secure access to oil. And this sounds like talking like an imperialist from the 19th century. It pains me to talk this way. But I'm certain that this is how the administration thinks.
You mentioned the Lewis doctrine in the sense
Where are you? I'm not quite sure where you are. Oh, okay, good.
That the United States needs to use its foreign policy in a military sense to demand respect. To what extent do you think the reaction of Libya to the invasion of Iraq is a result of that?
I think this is an excellent point, and one which we will hear a lot more about. Libya was what used to be called a pariah state which you didn't want to get close to. And this had a lot to do with the bombing of Pan Am Flight, whatever, in 1988. And Gaddafi is one of the most brilliant politicians in the Middle East. We think of him as sort of as a gangster. Gaddafi was the one who defeated the Seven Sisters. Who are the Seven Sisters? Okay, they are either Ivy League colleges for women, or they're the 7 big multinational oil corporations who were producing, okay? So OPEC gets created in 1960, and it's Gaddafi who breaks OPEC in 1970 with a very clever deal in which he plays, Exxon off against Marathon Oil. He's a very smart politician. And Gaddafi began to realize in the mid-90s, I'm in a corner in the doghouse. There's only one big country left. There's nobody else to protect me. I got to start moving out of the corner. So starting in 1998, Libyan policy begins to change and says, well, maybe we did wrong and all of that, right? But the timing of saying, okay, bring the inspectors in, has clearly something to do with him saying, okay, I get the message. They could pick me off the way they picked off Saddam Hussein. If the crazies are running the White House, who knows what's going on? Which is part of a deliberate strategy of the Bush administration. To play a little crazy is smart. Okay. So I think the hardness, the toughness of our policy didn't initiate the change in Libyan strategy, but it certainly contributed to the timing by which Libya really folded its hand. Yes.
Professor Katzenstein, would you say then that anti-Americanism is more of a structural problem, just it's inevitable due to our relative power in the international sphere, or would you say it's a result of American policies, like our search for oil in Saudi Arabia, that kind of thing?
Okay, you're listing two of the three general factors, right? The first one, our power. The third one, of what we do.
Right. What would you say is more influential?
I want to put in the other two or three too. That is, I think both of those are there. I think there is an inevitable, I come from a small family compared to your families. I have only 2 siblings, okay? But there was the big brother, okay? And he turned out to be a very nice guy once I grew up, but I didn't like him when he was big brother. Right? He could beat me up. He could eat my dessert. He could do all sorts of things. So I think there's something structural built into that, which can be is accentuated, I think, by policy. But I think, and this is my criticism of the Lewis Doctrine, is the historical roots of anti-Americanism, this ambivalence, go very, very deep. Europe has been both pro and anti-American for 150 years. Okay? And it's typically that the elites are anti and the people are for. Right? I mean, if you had to watch all those French movies, no good. Okay? If you're in the French population, they want to see the action movies. They want to see Arnold. Right? And this has been true in the 1920s. This is a long-standing history of class conflict, because America is the symbol of a non-hierarchical social system. Or at least so it's interpreted. I mean, I coming and living here now, I scratch my head and say, wow, they ought to come over here and look a little. But so I think it's not just those two factors, policy and structure. I find them hard to weigh. Okay. If you ask me what's the third most important one, it's democracy. Anti-Americanism comes with what we want, democracy. And we just have to live with it. But we certainly can accentuate it or ameliorate it through our policies. Okay, for those who have to go, maybe this is a good time. Just for a second. What's that? All right. Where's the mic?
Now that we've separated the sheep from the goats here, it's clear that people in other countries don't like President Bush, and probably voting him out of office is going to reduce some of that anti-Americanism, or at least anti-government sentiment. which of the two candidates do you think actually, though, I mean, in America we vote, the people of the world don't elect our leaders. Which of the two candidates now that Terry's emerged, do you think has a better overall strategy, not just to reduce anti-Americanism, but to contribute to, a stable world and a secure America?
I think the answer hangs on how you think about power, since we are about power and being powerful. And there are basically two ways of thinking. And one says, what's the saying? How many divisions has the Pope? Very few, right? But it's the Pope, I think, who brought down the Soviet Union. It's the legitimacy crisis which the Polish Catholics and the Polish trade union created. So if you look at the end of the Cold War, I don't think it was us, or Star Wars, or all the things which we point to proudly. It was the inner rot of the Soviet Union and some ideological force. And ideology in this context, for me, means legitimacy. Soviet Union had no legitimacy left. 9/11 has moved our foreign policy to say legitimacy does not matter as much as our concrete security interests. Now, as I've told you, I don't believe that our concrete security interests were threatened by Iraq. Quite the opposite. The evidence is quite strong that wasn't the reason for the war. I was anti-war from the very beginning. I said it's the security interest which are at stake after 9/11. That wouldn't mean I said the war is wrong in all circumstances. But the war was wrong under that circumstance because it could not get international support. And in any country you could see that you asked people before the war, including the United States, are you for or against the war? They said, with or without UN support. And that, we say with or without, you say with, the support of the war went up by 25 to 40% in all of these countries. It was important that you didn't trust your own government, not just in the United States, in general. People rightly in democracies don't trust their government. It's a good thing, right? Saying, if lots of governments tend to think this, then maybe our crooks aren't just putting over a fast one. Right? This was true in France, this was true in Germany, this was true in Japan, this was true here. Right? That force of legitimacy counts for a lot in an era where democracy is spreading. And I think the Bush administration was surprised. They knew it was important because they went to enormous length in February to get that UN resolution passed. You can't say that we didn't try. But Secretary of State Powell was fundamentally wrong in thinking he could deliver. He was, of course, asked by the President, can you deliver the votes in the Security Council? And he said in December, yes, I can. And he was wrong. Because the evidence wasn't in. It was not a compelling case. It's just quite clear. And so I think this force of legitimacy in an era of democratization which we have helped bring about is much more important now for fashioning a coherent, sustainable foreign policy strategy than we all thought before the war, including the opponents of the war. So by November, the administration talks like France. Adopts the French policy saying we're going to have to get out by June. And in January, we go back to the United Nations and say, please help us. It is a remarkable turnaround. And I think remarkable in the sense that it speaks for the American political system and the president to turn on a dime, on a miscalculated strategy. So I think the answer hangs on how do you think about power. And I don't know whether there is fundamental rethinking about how do we think about power is occurring in Washington. My sense is not. I think these are tactical concessions because the going is rougher than they expected. And therefore, I got an email from a friend of mine at 9:39 last night saying, I'm giving $2,000 to Kerry. That's the maximum I can give. I wrote him back and said, I'm giving $2,000. My wife will get $2,000. If my dog can give, that dog will give too. Because I think this is the most dangerous foreign policy strategy which we have conducted since the 1950s. And I think we will run into deep trouble if we do not realize the structural change that says legitimacy is really important. And since economically we cannot sustain it, it just seems self-evident to me.
You mentioned a point that Lewis failed to address about globalization and the exporting of religion and like the women's rights movements and things like that, a lot of the ideologies in the States. My question is, how are we supposed to rechannel globalization? I mean, I see it as kind of an inevitable thing that has happened throughout the, I mean, ever since like Hellenization. How are we supposed to rechannel it so that it benefits more of the third world countries, the war-ravaged countries especially?
Well, I think the Bush administration has made a good beginning. I mean, we have been the most miserly aid-giving country among the OECD countries for a long time. The richest country gives least. Okay? And the Bush administration has said, we're going to change this. For reasons, of course, which liberals detest. Has a lot to do with family planning policy. Okay? But still, it will double the aid budget if we follow through, which I don't think we will. I don't think we have that kind of cash any longer. So there will be one. And I also believe that the targeting of the aid makes a lot of sense to me, rather than just paying off your local dictator someplace. Right? So I think there are hopeful signs. But globalization, you know, I don't believe in globalization doing terrible things. I think terrible things are done by societies and polities to themselves. In some situations, this is wrong. I think that large parts of Africa where it's wrong because the resource base simply isn't there. But if you think of a country like South Korea, which, you know, the average per capita income in 1960 was $230. Okay? While Argentina's was $3,500. And you compare South Korea and Argentina now, and you say, it's not due to some global or international factor. It is due to how the people and the governments fashion and pursue their policies. So much of this globalization is a great, you know, is a great engine for progress and an opportunity. Are the societies prepared to do it? And can they do it? And you see the limits of globalization in our own polity. Because globalization is doing havoc if you're in the manufacturing sector in the Midwest, which may well be the reason why Bush will lose the election. It's the most plausible. If he's going to lose the election, it's likely for that reason. But why is that? Because if you lose your job, you lose your health care, you lose everything in the society because we have no social safety network. I wrote a book once, 20 years ago, on small states and world markets. They're much smaller. Okay, the trade GDP ratio is not 20% as in this country, it's 140%. You lose your job there, people say, of course you lose your job because world markets are too big for our small Dutch or Swiss or whatever economy. But there is a safety network and a training program so that you will get another job. And yes, you will not lose your health benefits. So the backlash here in the United States against globalization is intensified because the society hasn't organized for competition. In other parts of the world, it's quite different. South Korea, for example, has no safety network in 1997 when the Asian financial crisis comes, but it has a family support system which helps to buffer. Now the South Koreans have to build a government-orchestrated some sort of safety network. So I don't believe in saying, how do we temper globalization? Like you, I fear there is not much you can do about it. The question is, how do you exploit it to best effects? And I think aid from the rich countries is one important way, and I think we are much too miserly, not just in this country, but in Europe and Japan. You know, we're talking about a tiny percentage of GDP. I mean, 0.1% of GDP. I say, well, why is that? And the other one is organizing politics in societies so that they can take advantage of it. Last question.
Last question. Professor, I was wondering, in your view, to what extent does domestic American partisanship play in the development and implementation of foreign policy, and how does that cater to anti-American sentiment abroad?
I like partisanship. I think that's what democracy is about. And I know people saying, well, foreign policy stops at the water's edge. I say, wait a minute. I mean, if we are not free to debate, and fundamentally disagree, aren't we giving up something? So I think we're going to have a great debate in 2004. And since I think that whoever gets elected is likely to be smart, you can say many things about Cheney or Bush or Condoleezza Rice or Rumsfeld, but you can't say that they're stupid. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I think they made a fundamental strategic mistake. But as I said, I also see them turning on a dime. Okay? And of course, selling their product. I mean, they're lying just like all politicians. I'm deeply distrustful of politicians. I'm deeply distrustful of professors too. Okay, it's just an attitude I have, right? So, but does the polarization here feed into anti-Americanism over there? I don't think so. I think the anti-Americanism is fed by the politics, the democratic politics in particular, because if it's a dictatorship, and they are our allies, they'll shoot you if you're anti-American, right? So the fact that it's what's happening here is happening there, I say, that's a good thing. And you just have to be a little thick-skinned about it. And it's rational to be anti-American if, in fact, Americans have killed large numbers of your people. It's not irrational. It's utterly rational. That's how we would feel. So some of it you just have to live with, in the notion Americans like to be liked, right? So a little bit of more French arrogance wouldn't be so bad for us. Thank you.
Professor Katzenstein stopped through Utah on his way between 2 trips to California, and then in just a couple of days he's off to Australia for a couple of weeks to give more talks on the American Imperium book. As a way to try to coax him back to Utah at some point, we've got a gift for him as a native German. We thought he might be interested in a book on Utah's great ski slopes, and so hopefully this will lubricate the path back again. Thanks very much again for your attendance.